The hinge of the attic door groaned like a dying man, revealing decades of dust, and the one tiny locked trunk my husband swore he had forgotten. Inside, beneath the scent of mildew, I found the silver locket, proving my daughter's supposed dead aunt was not only alive, but married to my husband. The hinge of the attic door groaned like a dying man as I pushed it open, a sound that always sent a familiar chill down my spine. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the grimy dormer window, illuminating decades of forgotten things: moth-eaten wedding dresses, broken rocking horses, and the skeletal remains of Christmas decorations. I was up there looking for my grandmother's antique lace. My daughter Clara's baptism was next week, and I wanted something truly special, something with history. My husband, Mark, had always insisted the attic was his domain, a place for dusty tax documents and obsolete electronics. He was meticulous about organization everywhere else, but the attic remained a chaotic monument to deferred maintenance. He'd even installed a flimsy padlock on the outside latch years ago, claiming the floorboards were unsafe. I always suspected he just didn't want me rooting around in his man cave of nostalgia. I navigated past a stack of warped vinyl records, holding my breath against the smell of old wood and mildew. That's when I saw the trunk. It wasn't the big steamer trunk we used for winter blankets. This was small, made of dark, heavy oak, tucked deep under the eaves where the roof slanted sharply down. It didn't look like anything we owned. It looked older. Mark's presence felt heavy up here, even though he was supposedly at a conference 2 states away. Curiosity, that relentless little architect of disaster, took over. The trunk was locked, of course. I ran my fingers over the cold brass clasp, expecting to find another frustrating dead end. But this lock was different. It was tarnished, clearly very old, but unlike the modern padlock on the door, this one seemed vulnerable. I rummaged through the junk drawer of a nearby carpenter's bench, finding a thin, slightly bent letter opener. It took a solid 10 minutes of focused, silent work, the only sound the frantic rhythm of my own heart drumming against my ribs. Then, with a soft metallic snick, the lock sprang open. The lid was heavy. I braced my hands on the edges and lifted. Inside, there were no tax documents, no old electronics. The trunk was lined with deep purple velvet, and it was packed, almost exclusively, with old photographs, bundled with brittle, faded ribbon. They were sepia-toned, formal portraits of people I didn't recognize, stern Victorian faces staring out from the past. I dug deeper, past stacks of letters tied with string that crumbled slightly under my touch. Underneath all of that, resting alone in the center of the velvet lining, was a small silver locket. It was beautiful, intricate, etched with ivy leaves. It felt cool and significant in my palm. I pressed the small lever on the side, expecting to find a lock of hair, perhaps a faded miniature portrait. It popped open easily. The left side held a familiar picture. Mark, circa 10 years ago. Younger, his hair darker, a smile so genuine it almost hurt to look at it. He was wearing the blue shirt he wore on our honeymoon. My breath hitched. I looked closer at the right side, ready to see my own smiling face reflected back at me. The woman staring back was not me. She was stunning, with dark, severe hair pinned up and eyes that held an intensity that was almost unsettling. She was leaning into Mark, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a beautiful, intimate photo, the kind taken when 2 people are profoundly connected. My blood turned to ice water. I knew that intensity. I knew that angle of his smile. It was the look he reserved for moments of deep, unguarded affection. And I knew her, intellectually in a way that made my stomach heave. It was Sarah. Sarah Williams, Mark's college sweetheart. The one he claimed he hadn't spoken to in a decade. The one who, according to every story Mark had ever told me, had tragically died in a climbing accident in the Rockies right after graduation. He'd been devastated. He'd barely functioned for months. That grief, he always said, was what propelled him to finish his degree early and focus entirely on his career, and eventually on me. I flipped the locket over, checking the back, searching for some inscription, some clue that this was a trick, a costume party prop. There was nothing but the tarnished silver. I opened it again, staring at the two faces locked in that impossible moment. If Sarah died 10 years ago, how was she looking at him like this, in a photograph that looked no older than 5 years, taken perhaps on a real vacation, not a grim memorial site? The background was sun-drenched, showing palm trees and bright blue water. I slammed the locket shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the stifling quiet of the attic. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the trunk down before I dropped the silver piece. I stumbled backward, knocking into a forgotten standing lamp, sending it crashing down onto a pile of old blankets. I needed proof. I scrabbled through the rest of the trunk frantically, my initial desire for antique lace completely vaporized, replaced by a blinding, desperate need for the truth. Beneath a stack of heavy correspondence, I found a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't his handwriting on the cover. I yanked it open, skipping past the first few pages of flowery, unfamiliar cursive until I found a date near the middle that made my lungs seize up. October 14th, last year. The entry wasn't about a climbing trip. It was handwritten in Mark's familiar, precise script. The strain is showing. She asked again about the cottage near the lake. I told her it was sold. She needs to understand that this arrangement, this secret life, cannot compromise the stability I've built here. Sarah, you promised me you would stay quiet. The only way forward is for you to be gone. My vision swam. The air in the attic suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The strain? The secret life? Mark wasn't at a conference 2 states away. He was somewhere, building a life with a woman I thought was buried under a mountain somewhere in Colorado, and he had been actively ensuring she stayed hidden. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an old relic of lost love. This was active deception, a meticulously maintained lie spanning over a decade. I heard the familiar sound of the garage door rumbling open downstairs. My phone chimed. A text from Mark. Conference dinner is running late. I'll be home around 11. Sleep well. Love you. It was 7:15 p.m. He wasn't supposed to be home until midnight, maybe later. He was early. Panic spiked through me, sharp and immediate. Had he forgotten something? Was he coming up to check on his secret stash? I shoved the journal and the locket back into the velvet lining, slamming the heavy oak lid shut. The rusty lock hadn't re-engaged. I scrambled for the letter opener, managing to jam the clasp somewhat shut, hoping the weight of the trunk would keep it closed. I barely had time to stuff the trunk back under the eaves, kicking a dusty rug over the area, when I heard the heavy tread of his boots on the main staircase. He always took the stairs 2 at a time. I snatched the lamp, setting it back upright, trying to smooth my hair and my expression. I was halfway to the attic door when I froze. He wasn't coming up. He was stopping on the landing below, right outside the door. "Honey?" His voice was too casual, too bright. "I'm back early. Did you hear me come in? I forgot my presentation notes. Did you happen to see that old metal briefcase? It should be up there." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. He knew exactly what was in that trunk. He hadn't forgotten his notes. He'd come home to check on his lie. And now, here I stood, blocking the entrance to the one place in this house that held the proof that my entire marriage was built on a foundation of ash and staged death announcements. I stood motionless, the smell of dust and betrayal thick in my nostrils. The attic door creaked softly behind me as the house settled. "Just a minute, Mark," I called back, my voice sounding brittle and foreign. "I was just airing out the space." I knew if he stepped into that attic, he would see the disturbed rug, the slightly ajar trunk, the sweat on the floorboards where I had been kneeling. He would know I had found Sarah, and I had the chilling certainty that if I let him find those documents, I wouldn't just be dealing with a deception. I'd be dealing with a man capable of staging a death for an accomplice, and I would be in immediate danger of becoming the next person to disappear. I took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the door frame so hard my knuckles went white. I had to get out of this house, now, with Clara. But Mark was standing just 10 feet away, listening to every strained second of my silence. "What's wrong, babe?" he called again, and this time the casualness was gone, replaced by a hard, metallic edge. "Why are you just standing there?" The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I could hear him shifting his weight on the wooden landing below, the slight thud-thud of his expensive leather shoes on the old floorboards, the sound of a predator closing a distance. My mind was racing, trying to construct a believable lie fast enough to match the speed of his suspicion. I think I saw a mouse up here, Mark," I managed, injecting a shaky tremor into my voice that I hoped sounded like nervous distaste, not sheer terror. "A huge one. I'm coming down right now. Don't come up." A pause. A calculated beat of nothingness designed to make me panic further. "A mouse? Really, Sarah?" He used my actual name, but the way he said it, flat, devoid of warmth, felt like a threat. "You're not afraid of vermin. You're afraid of something else, aren't you?" That was it. He knew. He hadn't just forgotten his briefcase. He'd come home early because of some intuition, some tiny ripple I'd made in his carefully constructed reality. The weight of the journal in the trunk suddenly felt like a nuclear device waiting to detonate. I didn't answer. Instead, I spun around, yanked the attic door shut with violent speed, and fumbled blindly for the flimsy external padlock. My fingers were slick with cold sweat. I snapped the loop through the latch, but my hands were shaking too violently to engage the key. It just dangled uselessly. Thump, thump, thump. His boots were on the first few attic stairs now, heavy and purposeful. He wasn't running. He was walking with the slow, inevitable confidence of a man who knew his prey was cornered. "Open this door, Sarah. We need to talk about what you're doing up there." I backed away from the door, my gaze sweeping the dusty interior for an escape route that didn't exist. The only way out was down, past him, and I couldn't face him with the truth still hidden inches above his head. I had to buy time. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a thick, leather-bound photo album from the 1950s, and hurled it against the dormer window. The glass cracked with a loud, sharp report, but the old, double-paned structure held. It didn't shatter, but the sound was loud enough to create a distraction. "What in God's name are you doing?" Mark yelled from the bottom of the stairs, momentarily thrown off his measured ascent. "I'm calling the police, Mark!" I shrieked, knowing it was a bluff. He would talk his way out of any initial inquiry, spin this as a mental break, lid open again, pulling out the journal, lid open again, pulling out the journal and the locket. They needed to be gone, out of this house, somewhere he couldn't retrieve them before I packed Clara and ran. As I looked down at the journal, a loose page fluttered out, a single sheet of paper tucked into the very back cover, not handwritten, but printed. It was a death certificate. My eyes scanned the key details, heart pounding a desperate rhythm against my ribs. Name, Sarah Lillian Williams. Date of death, November 5th, 10 years ago. Cause of death, traumatic injury resulting from a fall, Rocky Mountain National Park. This was the official story, the foundation of his decade-long deception. But beneath the official seal, there was a handwritten annotation in the margin, in a precise, elegant hand. Sarah's handwriting, I was suddenly sure, the same script from the journal's early pages. They listed me as deceased. It was easier. Mark handled everything. The paperwork, the silence. He thinks this is over. He has no idea what I've done to secure my new life. It wasn't a note to me. It was a private victory lap. The woman I thought was dead wasn't a victim trapped by Mark. She was a co-conspirator who had used her own staged death as a tool, perhaps to escape something else entirely, and Mark had facilitated it. But what had she done to secure her new life? And why was Mark suddenly worried about her staying quiet last year? The attic door rattled violently. Mark was done playing games. He was trying to force the lock. The cheap metal of the padlock was starting to strain. I folded the death certificate and the locket, shoving them deep into the pocket of my jeans. The journal was too bulky. I had to leave it, but I needed to obscure the fact that I'd read it. I scooped up a handful of brittle, dried-out flower petals from a potpourri mix, ancient, smelling faintly of lavender and rot, and showered them over the open journal pages, scattering them haphazardly to make the disruption look like clumsy rummaging rather than focused investigation. The padlock shrieked in protest. One of the screws holding the latch plate to the door frame tore free with a sickening rip. "Sarah, if you break anything, I swear to God I will end you." Mark's voice was unrecognizable, raw with fury, and a deep-seated panic I had never heard before. It wasn't the voice of a betrayed husband. It was the voice of a man whose carefully managed threat assessment had just gone sideways. The door shuttered again, and the remaining metal groaned. I knew I had seconds. I bolted toward the small dormer window, the only source of light and the only potential exit that didn't involve confronting him head-on. It was narrow, but I was small. If I could get out onto the roofline, I could climb down the sturdy trellis we used for the wisteria vine, land on the shed roof, and drop into the yard. I threw my shoulder against the latch of the window. It was old, swollen shut by years of moisture. I kicked hard, once, twice. The sash finally gave way with a loud crack, opening maybe 12 inches before it caught on a splintered piece of wood. The attic door finally buckled. The wood around the lock splintered, and the entire frame burst inward with a crash that sounded like a gunshot. Mark stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, framed by splintered wood and dust. He wasn't holding a briefcase. In his hand, glinting wickedly in the dim attic light, was a heavy, silver-plated trophy, an award from some forgotten corporate gala. His eyes weren't fixed on me. They were fixed on the trunk. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying focus. "You shouldn't have gone looking in my things, Sarah," he said, his voice now dangerously calm, the fury having solidified into something much worse. He took one slow, deliberate step into the attic, raising the heavy trophy over his head. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed my shoulders together, forced my head and torso through the narrow gap of the window, ignoring the painful scrape of the wood against my ribs. I let my legs dangle out into the evening air, searching frantically for the trellis. Just as my fingers brushed the rough wood of the trellis support, I felt a searing, agonizing pain explode across my left ankle. Mark hadn't aimed for my head. He had aimed for my escape. The heavy trophy had connected squarely with my lower leg, and a blinding, white-hot sensation shot up my entire body, stealing my breath. I screamed, my grip slipping immediately. I tumbled backward, falling toward the hard, unforgiving earth of the attic floor, the sound of Mark's triumphant, chilling roar echoing in my ears as I fell. The impact was jarring, a violent interruption to the sickening trajectory of my fall. I didn't quite hit the floorboards. Instead, I slammed hard against a stack of old canvas paint stretchers we'd stored years ago, their sharp corners digging painfully into my back and ribs. The air whooshed out of my lungs in a pathetic gasp. For a moment, the world dissolved into a ringing white haze, smelling overwhelmingly of mildew and fear. The pain in my ankle was immediate and absolute, a searing, crushing agony that signaled something was catastrophically wrong. I couldn't move it. It felt like broken glass under my skin. Mark stood over the gaping, splintered doorway, breathing heavily, the heavy silver trophy still held high, his shadow engulfing me. He hadn't expected me to fall back into the attic. He had expected me to hit the ground outside. "You should have stayed put," he hissed, taking another step towards me, his eyes wild but focused, the corporate executive veneer completely stripped away, revealing something feral underneath. He didn't look like my husband. He looked like a hired heavy who had just been given a bonus. My survival instinct, primal and immediate, kicked in. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. I had to stall. I curled into a fetal position, clutching my leg, letting out a choked sob that was half performance, half genuine agony. "Mark, please, it hurts. You broke my leg," I cried, trying to look pathetic and harmless. He paused, his stance faltering for the barest fraction of a second. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. While he was registering the damage, I reached out blindly, sweeping my hand across the dusty floor near the edge of the trunk. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic, a thick, tarnished brass hinge that had ripped off the attic doorframe when he forced it open. He lunged then, bringing the heavy trophy down in a downward arc aimed squarely at my head. I managed to raise my forearm instinctively, bracing for the blow. The trophy connected with my forearm with sickening force, a dull, heavy thud that vibrated up to my shoulder. The pain was blinding, but the impact deflected the weapon just enough so it glanced off my skull instead of crushing it. I tasted blood immediately. My arm was clearly fractured or severely bruised, but the deflection had saved me. Mark stumbled slightly from the force of his own swing, cursing under his breath. I used the pain in my arm to haul myself backward, crab-walking desperately toward the far corner of the attic, dragging my useless leg behind me. I needed separation. I needed a barrier. My back hit the sloping roof beam. Nearby, leaning against the wall, were the long, slender pieces of lumber I'd seen earlier, thin, untreated 2x4s, intended perhaps for shelving that was never built. I scrabbled for the nearest one, a 6-foot length of rough wood, and pulled it toward me with my good arm, just as Mark recovered his balance. "Enough games," he roared, throwing the trophy aside in frustration. He didn't want to kill me yet. He wanted the evidence. He knew I had something on me, the locket, the certificate, and he couldn't afford a messy scene that might lead to questions. Questions that would reveal Sarah wasn't dead. He advanced slowly, deliberately closing the distance. I held the length of wood like a desperate, untrained fencer. "Stay back, Mark. I know about Sarah. I know she's alive. I have proof." I spat the words out, hoping the mention of her name, the mention of the secret, would freeze him. It didn't. It seemed to infuriate him into a final, decisive action. "She is dead, Sarah. In this house, she is dead, and you will be just as dead if you interfere with what I've built." He reached for me, his hands outstretched, not with an object, but with his bare hands, a gesture far more intimate and terrifying than the trophy strike. I jammed the end of the 2x4 forward, catching him in the solar plexus. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was unexpected. Mark grunted, doubling over momentarily, his face turning a deep, alarming crimson. This was my chance. Ignoring the screaming protest from my mangled ankle, I twisted my body, using my good arm to lever myself upright, dragging my weight against the beam. I staggered toward the open window, the hole he had made in the outside world. I kicked out with my good leg, propelling myself half in, half out of the attic opening. The rough wood of the dormer window frame tore at my thigh as I squeezed through. I ignored the sharp pain in my arm and the throbbing in my leg, focusing solely on the outside air, the sheer drop. I managed to get my upper body onto the steep, shingled roof. The shingles were rough against my palms, offering surprisingly good purchase. I looked down. The trellis was maybe 8 feet below me, a sturdy, crisscrossing web of wood that looked like salvation. I glanced back. Mark had straightened up, shaking off the hit, and he was peering out the window after me. His expression was calculating. He didn't rush the window. He knew I was trapped between the steep pitch of the roof and the drop. "You can't get down on that leg, Sarah. You'll fall," he warned, his voice resonating with cruel certainty. "Come back inside. We can talk about the separation papers tomorrow. Cleanly." I tested my weight on the good foot. I could feel the bone in my arm begin to swell sickeningly beneath my torn skin. I looked down at the ground, then back at Mark, poised in the doorway of our shared life, ready to ensure I never spoke again. I had the locket and the certificate burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't go back in. I couldn't wait for help. Clara was home alone downstairs watching TV, blissfully unaware that her father was moments away from committing an act of violence up in the dust. I took the final, desperate gamble. I let go of the roof beam with my left arm, the one he had struck. I pushed off with my right, aiming my body for the trellis, praying that the pain wasn't too debilitating to maintain my grip on the descent. I swung out into the cool evening air, catching the top bar of the trellis with my good hand. For a glorious, terrifying second, I was suspended, dangling. The wood held. I began to slide down, faster and faster, the rough wood scraping my palms raw as I tried to slow my descent toward the shed roof below. I was halfway down the trellis when I heard it. Not the sound of Mark climbing out, but a different sound entirely. A sound that made the adrenaline surge through my veins even stronger than the pain. The unmistakable, high-pitched wail of a car alarm, instantly followed by a sharp, panicked shout from downstairs, much closer to the front of the house. Clara. Mark froze in the attic window, his head snapping toward the front of the house, a look of absolute disorientation washing over his face. He hadn't accounted for Clara being home early, or perhaps he hadn't accounted for the fact that his violence might have alerted the neighbors. He whirled around, abandoning the immediate threat of me on the trellis, and lunged back into the attic, scrambling toward the attic door, not to follow me, but to get downstairs. I seized the moment, dropping the last few feet onto the shed roof with a muffled thud that jarred my broken ankle fiercely, ignoring the fresh wave of nausea. I scrambled to the edge of the shed roof, preparing to drop the final 6 feet to the grass. I looked toward the house. Mark's footsteps were pounding down the main stairs, a desperate, heavy rhythm. He was heading for Clara. I dropped onto the lawn, landing awkwardly, falling immediately to my knees, dragging my useless leg behind me. I was free of the house, but Clara was still inside, and Mark was heading toward her, his carefully constructed facade shattered, his desperation now absolute. I looked at the front door, knowing I had to get inside, knowing the broken leg might render me helpless. As I pushed myself forward on my elbows, aiming for the front porch, I saw a dark shape moving quickly near the side of the house, disappearing into the deep shadows cast by the massive oak tree. It was too tall to be Mark rushing toward the front. It was someone else, and they were coming from the direction of the street, moving with a practiced, silent speed that spoke of surveillance, not random neighborhood interference. The car alarm that had distracted Mark wasn't his, it was someone else's. Someone was here, someone who knew about Sarah, someone who was watching him, and they were moving toward the house right now while Mark was distracted by Clara. I was caught in the middle of a confrontation I didn't even know was starting. The sight of the silent, fast-moving shadow near the oak tree completely eclipsed the agonizing throbbing in my ankle and the dull ache in my arm. This wasn't a domestic incident spilling into the yard. This was an ambush. Mark hadn't just been maintaining a lie about a dead woman. He was actively engaged in something so dangerous that someone else was now arriving. People who seemed very proficient at moving unseen and who had clearly triggered an alarm that wasn't his. My immediate instinct to drag myself toward the front door to protect Clara warred violently with the primal need to flee this dangerous property. But Clara was my anchor. I pushed off the grass with my elbows, ignoring the searing pain as I dragged my ruined leg, moving in a grotesque, desperate crawl toward the porch steps. As I neared the safety of the covered entry, I heard Mark's voice again, but this time it was strained, pleading, a tone I hadn't heard since our wedding vows. He wasn't shouting at me. He was shouting toward the interior of the house. "Get out! Get out of here! Don't look! It's nothing!" Then came a muffled sound from inside. Not a scream, but a heavy thud, followed by a sudden, absolute silence that was infinitely more terrifying than any noise. Clara. She hadn't just heard the car alarm. She had witnessed something when Mark rushed downstairs. The dark figure by the oak tree suddenly straightened. It wasn't a teenager messing with a car. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark, nondescript tactical clothing, moving with the economical efficiency of someone highly trained. He paused, looking directly at the house, then his gaze flicked upward toward the attic, and finally settled on me, crawling uselessly near the porch. He hadn't come for me. He had come for Mark, or perhaps for whatever was in that attic trunk. The man didn't approach the front door. Instead, he began moving along the foundation of the house, heading toward the back where the garage and the adjacent shed, the roof I'd just tumbled from, were located. He was flanking the property, establishing control. an unsettling reminder that the danger here was far beyond simple marital betrayal. The journal hadn't just mentioned a secret life. It implied connections to something deeply illicit, perhaps even involving the kind of people capable of faking death certificates and employing outside operatives. I finally reached the bottom step of the porch, clutching the splintered remains of the attic door latch, my only piece of forensic evidence. I had to get inside. I clawed my way up the first step, my good arm trembling with exhaustion. Just as I hauled myself onto the top step, the front door flew open, not pushed by Mark, but yanked inward violently from the inside. It wasn't Mark standing there. It was the shadowy man from the side of the house. He had somehow circled around the entire property in seconds, moving with impossible speed, anticipating every possible escape route. He wasn't armed with a trophy. He held a small, matte black piece of equipment in one hand. He took one look at my prone, bloody, and clearly injured state on the porch, his eyes flicking from my immobilized leg to the locket materializing through the ripped pocket of my jeans, and he didn't even pause. "Civilian contamination. Subject is localized," he muttered into a device near his ear, his voice low and professionally detached. He didn't seem interested in apprehending me. He was assessing damage and reporting status. Then he stepped past me, his eyes burning with professional focus, and walked into the entryway, into the house where Mark and Clara were. "Mark, this is over. We know you secured the package. Where is it?" the operative demanded, his voice echoing into the foyer. He wasn't asking about me. He was asking about whatever secret Sarah had been holding on to that made her stage her own death. I heard a muffled shout from deeper inside the house, Mark defending himself perhaps, or trying to shield Clara. The operative didn't wait. He moved forward, weapon raised, and this time it wasn't a decorative trophy. It was a compact, serious-looking piece of metal, dark and utilitarian. I tried to scream Clara's name, tried to warn the operative that a child was in danger, but the effort sent a spike of pain through my arm, and all that escaped my lips was a raw, ragged croak. I watched helplessly from the porch as the dark figure rounded the corner into the main living area. A single, sharp, deafening sound ripped through the quiet evening air. It was the sound of a suppressed discharge, a heavy pft that suggested a lethal projectile traveling at high velocity. It was followed almost immediately by Mark's cry of pain, then another, louder thud as something heavy, perhaps Mark himself, hit the floor. Silence descended again, heavier and more absolute than before. The operative didn't call out again. He was efficient. I lay there on the porch, bleeding, broken, listening to the terrifying quiet inside the house, knowing my husband was either dead or neutralized, and that a trained professional was now in control of the only thing that mattered, Clara. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, exposed on the porch. I used my good arm and the leverage of the doorframe, ignoring the fire in my ankle, to drag my body across the threshold and into the dark entryway. The foyer was dimly lit. I crawled forward, peering around the door jamb toward the living room. The operative was gone. The living room was empty. But in the center of the Persian rug, a dark, rapidly expanding stain was soaking into the wool. Mark was gone. I scanned the room desperately for Clara. No sign. Then my eyes caught sight of the wall opposite the living room, where the coat closet was located. The door was slightly ajar. I dragged myself toward it, heart hammering against the floorboards, fueled now not by fear of Mark, but by the desperate need to find my daughter before whoever this operative worked for realized there was a second casualty, a small, terrified witness. I reached the closet door, my fingers brushing the cool brass knob. I yanked it open, peering into the cramped space, expecting to see Clara hiding, curled up and silent. The closet was empty, save for Mark's winter coat. But pinned to the inside of the coat lining, right at chest level, was a small white note card. And on that card, written in the same elegant, confident script as the annotation in Sarah's death certificate, was a single, chilling sentence. "Don't worry about the girl, Sarah. She's much safer with me now. Meet me at the drop point, or she vanishes forever." The note card felt slick and impossibly cold in my good hand, a physical manifestation of the nightmare that had just consumed my life. Safer with me now. The operative hadn't been working for Mark. He had been working for her. Sarah, the woman who was supposed to be dead for 10 years. She hadn't been hiding from Mark's scrutiny. She had been planning her next move, using her fake death as leverage to reclaim something, or someone, she believed was hers. And Clara, my innocent daughter, was now the key to an elaborate, decade-long con. The crushing pain in my leg and arm was momentarily muted by a surge of pure, protective adrenaline. I crumpled the note, clutching it with the locket and the death certificate, the totality of Mark's criminal scaffolding. I had to move. If the operative had taken Clara to a drop point, he wouldn't be far, and the silence he had left behind suggested he hadn't wanted to cause a protracted scene that might attract actual police attention. Just enough localized chaos to retrieve Mark and the package. I looked back at the entryway. Mark was gone. The pool of blood was real, a thick, dark stain confirming the horrifying finality of the operative's arrival. He was neutralized, silenced to prevent him from exposing the network that Sarah had so carefully constructed around her staged demise. My cell phone. It was still in my back pocket, mercifully untouched during the chaos. My fingers fumbled, locating the device, but my mobility was zero. I couldn't crawl fast enough to catch them. I had to call for help, but what could I say? My dead college friend showed up, killed my husband, and kidnapped our daughter as leverage to force me to meet her at a secret location? They'd lock me in a padded room faster than they'd issue an Amber Alert. I had to go to the drop point myself. I looked down at my shattered ankle, then back at the house. I couldn't drive, but I could crawl. I could drag myself. I pulled myself back into the living room, surveying the wreckage, my eyes drawn to the one object that might offer a path: Mark's briefcase. He had claimed he forgot his presentation notes. It had been lying near the foot of the stairs. It wasn't the briefcase he was looking for. It was the cover for whatever he was protecting. I dragged myself to the briefcase. It was heavy, locked, and made of old, scarred leather. I didn't have time to pick it. Remembering the flimsy letter opener I'd used on the attic trunk, I frantically searched the immediate area. Nothing. Then I remembered the trophy. It was lying near the attic door, a massive piece of plated silver. I crawled back toward the attic entrance, retrieved the heavy trophy, its weight surprising, almost reassuring, and returned to the briefcase. I jammed the edge of the heavy base into the seam of the lock and brought the trophy down in a heavy, muffled blow, cushioning the sound as best as I could against the thick rug. The lock snapped. Inside, there were no presentation notes. There were neat stacks of bearer bonds, thick bundles of untraceable cash, and tucked into a slim side pocket, a small encrypted satellite phone. And next to the phone, a single, sealed envelope addressed to me in Mark's familiar, precise handwriting. I tore it open with my good hand. Sarah, if you are reading this, I failed. She came back. The whole thing was never about escaping. It was about establishing leverage for the consortium. They need total operational silence. Sarah Williams didn't die in the Rockies. She was recruited by a deep cover network and used her death to cut ties, creating a clean slate for intelligence work. She needed me to maintain the illusion, and I needed the money to keep her quiet. Clara, she's not your biological daughter. She was the asset Sarah secured during her false retirement, the child of a key operative who died. Sarah wants her back to complete the recruitment process. I couldn't let her take Clara. I tried to stall. The drop point is the old lighthouse pier, coordinates enclosed. Take the cash, take the phone, run. Don't let her recruit you both. The betrayal was layered like shale. Not only was my marriage a lie based on a staged death, but Clara wasn't even mine. I was just the caretaker, the perfect domestic shield for a decade of clandestine operations. The coordinates inside the envelope led to the abandoned municipal pier just outside the city limits, a known secluded spot. It was now or never. I grabbed the cash, the sat phone, and Mark's letter opener, stuffing everything into my pocket alongside the locket and the damning note. Using the momentum from my good arm and bracing against the wall, I managed to haul myself to the front door. The operative was gone. He had Clara. I burst out onto the porch, ignoring the blinding pain, and started dragging myself down the steps and across the lawn toward the street, aiming for the relative safety of the residential blocks before the perimeter of this disaster widened. I reached the curb, dragging my body forward, when the sat phone in my pocket buzzed violently. It wasn't ringing, it was receiving a data packet. I dug it out with shaking fingers, managing to activate the screen. It was a GPS ping, updating in real time, showing a single moving dot labeled Asset, heading directly toward the lighthouse pier. The operative had taken Clara to the rendezvous point, but beneath the moving dot, another signal was flashing, much slower, originating from the same location, a secondary beacon labeled Contingency. It was slow, but it was moving away from the pier, heading rapidly south toward the state line. A third message popped up on the screen, a text message from an unknown number, coinciding perfectly with the slow-moving beacon. I'm taking the contingency route. If you want your daughter, you have 20 minutes. Come alone. The pier is a trap. The message was signed with a single archaic initial, S. Sarah. She hadn't just staged her death. She had anticipated betrayal from her own network. She had left herself an escape route, a backup plan involving Clara, and she was now using that escape route to lure me, the woman who replaced her, into a confrontation on her own terms. I had a choice. Trust the operative's information about the final drop, or follow the coded escape path left by the woman who faked her own death to secure the ultimate leverage. If I went to the pier, I would likely find Mark's empty briefcase and a cleanup crew. If I followed the contingency beacon, I was walking straight into the web of the true survivor. With my ankle useless and my arm throbbing, I dragged myself toward the direction of the contingency beacon, the sat phone blinking rapidly, a countdown to the final, brutal showdown with the ghost who refused to stay buried.